Welcome, everyone. I'm Susan Hibbard with the BUILD Initiative. We're very happy to sponsor today's webinar on behalf of the Early Learning Challenge Collaborative, which is a partnership of BUILD and the First 5 Years Fund. The collaborative, as many of you have heard over and over again during this series of webinars, was started in 2011 when the administration announced the Early Learning Challenge. The idea of the collaborative was to help states as they sought to apply for and then later implement the Early Learning Challenge grants. And we've just begun the process of our third goal, of reaching toward our third goal, which was to document the outcomes related to this new federal funding. BUILD's role in the Early Learning Challenge Collaborative is to coordinate technical assistance and learning community activities. So this webinar is one of those learning community activities and is actually the last in our series geared toward helping the applicants for this new round of Early Learning Challenge. We have been very excited and pleased and grateful by the leadership shown by the grantee states and their sharing of information from the work that they've been doing over the last 2 years, and this webinar is no exception. We'll be drawing from two of those leaders. And at the end of the webinar, I'll say a little bit more about some of the help that the Early Learning Challenge Collaborative could supply if your state is still looking for some support. But for now, I'll just say a few logistical things. We have you all presented, muted except for the presenters. But if you want to ask a question, all you have to do is press *7 to unmute yourself. And then when you're done asking a question, you can press *6 to mute yourself again. Or you can probably see a little chat box on the lower left-hand side of your screen. You can write a question in the chat box. The presenters will all be able to see it, and it might be something they can respond to in writing, or the moderator can ask the question of the presenters during the webinar. You could also raise your hand virtually, and the moderator could call on you, and then you could unmute yourself. And again, that's *7. So I want to turn it over to our moderator today, Sherri Killins. Sherri was the commissioner of the Department of Early Education and Care in Massachusetts when they wrote their winning application on the Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge grant. And this webinar is about Section D. Massachusetts was, I think, the second or third highest scorer in this section. So she's been helping us to plan this session and will moderate it. And Sherri, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Susan, so much. And I want to also welcome our presenters for today, Sue Russell and Dan Haggard. Sue is currently the Executive Director of T.E.A.C.H Early Childhood National Technical Assistance Center, which helps states to implement effective workforce strategies to address education, compensation, retention of their early education and care workforce. She has over 40 years experience in early childhood profession, and most recently as the president of Child Care Services Association. And Dan is the Deputy Director of Early Childhood Services within the New Mexico Children, Youth, and Families Department. That division aligns and integrates early care and education programs from young children by consolidating infant mental health, child care, pre-kindergarten, Head Start, professional development, early child care, quality initiatives, home visiting, and other state and federally funded programs for young children in one governmental agency. So we're real excited to have a conversation today. We have 3 goals for today's session: to review the design, implementation, and challenges of a early childhood workforce development system. Whether you win or not, this is critical work to be done, and we have great presenters to help you think about that work. To review the requirements of Section D, which is called the Great Early Childhood Workforce System. Specifically, we'll have Dan talk about D1 and Sue talk about D2 of the 2013 Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge application, and we'll close with a conversation on strategy. And we want to make sure that we provide you some specific examples from other state systems so that as you think about your barriers and design elements in your system, your workforce system, you'll have something, some ideas to think about. We want to begin, though, by starting with the National Association for the Education of Young Children's Framework for Professional Development Systems. It's a resource. There's a link at the end of the PowerPoint. But it says state policy should create an integrated system of professional development, uniting the early childhood sectors, child care, Head Start, pre-kindergarten, public school, early intervention, and special education. And this is no different than what is required in the Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge application. And essential policy areas are around professional standards, career pathways, and articulation. How do you use training and professional development and college courses as you build competencies in your workforce? And then finally, the system should have an advisory structure. How are you making decisions? How are you including educators? How are you working with your higher education institutions? How do you create a governance structure to make some of these policy decisions? You need data, and there's a lot of talk about professional qualification registries, but how are you using that data to advance your early childhood workforce? And then, of course, financing, which is a huge struggle for most adults that are working in our field and in financing the kind of system we want to be accessible and affordable for the workforce. Going now to the 2013 application, when you think about the scoring criteria, they want to make sure you've got a quality implementation plan. They want to look for the extent to which different types of early learning development programs, workforce are included. And then, of course, we've talked about this in other webinars, the extent to which the unique needs of a state special population, and that's defined by the state around high needs, is addressed by your workforce. So I now want to turn it over to Dan to give you some more specifics about D1. Welcome, Dan. Dan? Dan?
There you go. Sorry,
okay.
I was muted and had to figure out which buttons to push here.
I'm sorry.
I think that this section is really important, and I know that for us in writing our proposal, we weren't successful the first time, and it really helped us clarify a lot of our thinking and do some strategic planning around all of these issues. So I'm hoping that it will serve the same purpose for all of you. Section D1 is really talking about the competencies that are required and how to organize those competencies as the framework as the foundation for a progression of credentials. And I know that you all probably do the same thing, but when I get an RFP or when I'm looking at an application like this, I really look at very literally at some of the words. And so in looking at the words that are here, I'm sure that you've noticed that the word common and the word statewide is noted repeatedly. So it looks to me as though it's clear that this application is calling for a set of common competencies across systems. In other words, what do all early childhood educators, if they're in early intervention, if they're in child care, if they're in special education, if they're a home visitor, what is that common body of knowledge that all of those people working with young children need to know? And it needs to be statewide. In other words, they're looking for a statewide system, and they're looking at this workforce knowledge and the competency framework to improve child outcomes. The next part is talking more specifically about this common statewide progression. And I think that the word progression here is really important because it seems to me that what they're calling for is a leveling of those competencies in order to have a continuum of credentials and degrees. So a spiraling framework to provide this career lattice or ladder as is commonly referred to. Then, of course, they're really focusing on secondary education and for post-secondary education, higher education, and talking about how to align professional development opportunities with that competency framework and assuming the progression of credentials and licensure. I think that it's important to do the same exercise with this next section that's really defining what that workforce knowledge and competency framework is, what's required in terms of it to be. I think I used to, when I was talking with different states, I used to say there are no rules. Every state is different. You need to develop the professional development system based on the unique attributes of your own state. This is really calling for some very specific things. So I think that it's important to pay attention to these guidelines if you indeed are going to apply. Going to slide number 10.
Okay, here we want audience participation. You know, state workforce systems, knowledge and competencies are often placed in different parts of government. So we want to get to know the audience a little better. If you would use your mouse and select where is your statewide workforce knowledge and competencies framework housed? State government? Is it in your higher education system? Is it in multiple places? Say Head Start and Child Care and public preschool have their own, or you really don't feel like you have a statewide placement of your workforce knowledge and competencies. So you can click a button now. We'll leave it open a couple of minutes till we get some responses. And then we'll be able to see how the audience is responding. Okay, a couple more people. Okay, Megan, why don't you close that poll? Great. So it looks like for many of the participants that your workforce competencies and system sits inside of state government, a few more in higher ed, but there's some of you where the workforce system is in multiple places and at least one participant who feels like you don't really have one. And so we hope today's conversation through the webinar will be instructive about how to manage it, whether it's in government, higher ed, and what you need to do if it's in multiple places or you don't have one to create that statewide common set of standards that Dan introduced a few moments ago. Thank you. Dan?
Sure. Let's go on and talk about what I think are is something that's often overlooked, and I think that it's really important to be inclusive in the development of your professional development system. And I think that historically higher ed has sort of driven the decision-making regarding professional development, and I think that it's really important to broaden that. And in fact, I think that it's really important for higher ed to be in a position of being responsive rather than being the sole driver of the system. And so you're getting some of my opinion here, but I think that historically we have not had a developed state government system of early education. We have not had credentials and licensure that higher ed needed to be responsive to. We have not had a strong workforce at the community level in order to be able to voice as consumers what it is that they at the community level need. I hate to use the word product, but they should be able to have a voice in communicating to higher ed whether or not the students that are being provided as graduates to them have the skills and the competencies that are able to do the work. And so I want to talk just a little bit about the importance of creating an infrastructure at the state level, statewide, in order that there be a common infrastructure, and the importance of there being an entity that provides the leadership for this process. And it's really critical to understand that that leadership needs to be funded in a way that it's recurring. This is not going to just be a project funded by Race to the Top. This is something that needs to be part of the state infrastructure, and it needs to be funded in a way that it's sustainable and recurring and ongoing, because we've been, for example, at this for 20 years now, and we are just now getting to some really critical issues regarding English language learners and issues that are really critical that we really developmentally haven't been ready to address until now. So this is not something that's just going to be for a couple years, you have it done, and then you're finished with it. I think that it's really important that the state assume ownership of this professional development system and responsibility for the development of it. It's a state government function to ensure that professionals are equipped and have the competencies that are required in order to do the work of the programs that they're funding. So the leadership factor is really important, and I think it's really critical that you create common vocabulary, a common vision of what that professional development system needs to look like. So I would recommend, and this is something that goes back almost 20 years to a Partners in Change project that Wheelock College sponsored, and I think that it's really important when in this process to have higher education present, but it's also important to have state government program managers present, and I think it's especially important to create that partnership at the table and have community partners there, because they are the front line, and they need to be able to hire people who can hit the ground running, so to speak, and do the work in Head Start, do the work in state-funded pre-K, do the work in home visiting, and they shouldn't have to retrain them in order for them to be successful as professionals in those systems. And so I think that it's really important to have all those people at the table, not just higher ed faculty saying what their system should look like. It's really important for them to be in a position of listening to state government program managers as well as community practitioners and kind of switch roles in a way, and for their the system that's developed to be responsive to the needs of the state as well as the community, and incorporate all the knowledge that those higher ed faculty bring with them. So I think that one of the ways that I would recommend beginning is to ask some common questions that are not rooted in the dialogue that sometimes happens between two-year institutions and four-year institutions, but asking real foundational questions that sometimes get overlooked, or there's sometimes people make assumptions about these things, and as a result, halfway down the road, people don't really know where it is that they're going. So it's important to have a lot of input and a lot of dialogue between all of the players and create some foundational decisions. One of the things, for example, that's really not a very easy answer is, what is a profession? And who in our field is a professional? Is everybody who works with young children a professional? Or do you need to acquire certain competencies and a level of skill demonstrated by credentials in order to be a professional? Now, Sue's going to talk about compensation and other issues later on, and I remember one conversation with a legislator saying that to me, yes, we don't have a problem adequately compensating early childhood professionals as long as they have the competence and the qualifications in order to justify that compensation. So this conversation about who is a professional and what is professional development is really critical, because professional development in some places and for some people means anything that happens to enhance the skills of a person working with children and families. Now then, how does that play in terms of the word training? Is there a difference between professional development and training? And so I think that it's really important to have the conversation in order to clarify what it is that you indeed are talking about. For example, is professional development pre-service? Is it in-service? What's the role of higher education? What is the role of in-service training providers? As you all know very well, we not only have siloed systems, we have siloed systems of what I call system-specific or in-service training for child care providers, for Part C, Part B, Head Start, and it's really important, I think, to begin to differentiate between what professional development is and the difference between system and the difference with system-specific training. And we can talk more about that, and you may have questions about that as we move along. But there really is a very distinct difference, as we have defined it, at least here in New Mexico, between professional development and in-service or system-specific training. Some people initially had trouble using the word training, but I don't think there's anything wrong with using that word to describe some very important functions within our system. So I think that it's really important, too, to ask what are the expected outcomes of a professional development system? We now have program standards, which by and large we didn't have before. We now have outcomes for children, early learning guidelines that we, by and large, didn't have before. We have standards that, think about Head Start standards or state-funded pre-kindergarten standards. We not only have these QRIS general quality rating standards across systems, but we have very specific system standards as well. And so what is the responsibility of the professional development system preparing people to work with those standards? And so I think the expectation of this application is that those all be tied together. So again, we're asking, who do we commonly view as professionals? And I think that it's really important. Sometimes early childhood people, we're sort of like an island unto ourselves, and we're talking to ourselves a lot. But it's really important, if we want to be regarded as professionals, to really look outside early childhood, because we can define professional for ourselves, and that's fine and dandy, but would legislators regard the professionals that we regard as professionals and be willing to compensate them adequately? So I think that it's really important to look at some other professions and really study, what does their system of professional development look like. We have found, for example, two areas that have been really helpful to us. Nurses, for example, because it's a very clear delineation of, or as they actually call in this application, a progression of certification and licensure based on the responsibility, the resultant responsibilities based on the competencies of that level of certification and licensure. So that has been a really good example for us to look at in the development of our system. Then we've also looked at attorneys in terms of the profession developing and the state itself developing competencies, and there being a competency-based system and a demonstration of knowledge and competence in order for individuals to attain licensure to practice. And then there are paralegals. And so you begin looking at these other systems, and you really get an idea of how they have organized themselves in terms of a progression of licensure and certification based on competencies, and how they have essentially leveled roles and responsibilities within their very broad profession. I think that also we need to look at who the professional development system is for when we're doing this work, because in order to really effectively develop competencies, you need to know what systems are included. Is early childhood special education included in your professional development system, or does it function separately? Is it only child care? I think if it's only child care, you will not be competitive in this section. So I think that it's really important to look and define very clearly what systems are included in the professional development system. And in fact, they outline that to a certain extent within the application itself. And what personnel in those systems are and aren't included. For example, OTs, PTs, speech-language pathologists, those professionals have their own system of licensure and professional preparation. So you begin looking at the systems that are included, and then you begin looking at the people working in those systems and the role that those personnel the role and the responsibility for those personnel. And then you begin, like nurses, you can begin to see the levels of qualifications that are required. For example, maybe in your pre-K system there's a bachelor's level required, but maybe at the assistant level there is an assistant teacher an AA requirement. And so what is the different levels of competence that are required for people working in those different roles? The other thing that people sometimes forget to really talk about and come to some determination about, and it leads to a lot of confusion in the end, is this just 0 to 5? Is it 0 to 8? If it's 0 to 8, then you're including the public school system and the competence and the Common Core, and so you're getting into a broader category of professional development. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's just critical to define that in order to know how to establish that body of knowledge that's required. So I'm just going to give you an example of the foundational decisions that we made probably 15 years ago that we are still using to guide the development of our system. First of all, we decided that it would be inclusive, and you can see there how we defined inclusive, that it would be birth or prenatal through 3rd grade in all children and all learning systems, including public school. And in fact, we have statutory responsibility to do that work. And I think I can talk a little bit about the importance of having that statutory authority, because there has to, that licensure and certification, especially when you're working in the public school system, there are certain requirements in order for it to count for salary schedules, etc. We decided that it would be competency-based, and we decided that our professional development system would be transcript-based. In other words, professional development in the state of New Mexico happens within higher education. We decided that it would be universally accepted across all of those systems. It would be applicable across all of those systems, available universally and fully accessible. We're still working on that. We decided that it would be fully articulated. All the levels are going to count toward more advanced levels, and that there would be no dead ends. Now, we decided that as a community, and the implications of that are significant. What that meant was that our higher education system had to not offer the AAS degree any longer, for example. So we took that foundational decision very seriously, and as a result, our higher education system needed to be responsive to that foundational decision that was made. We determined as a community that it would be integrated into the infrastructure of state government. It would become a function of state government. It would be statutorily enabled by our legislature, and so it would be legitimate, so to speak. The other thing that I think was really important is that we talked at length about how it would relate to then community-based training and formal, and as a higher ed being the formal component, and then there being non-formal or in-service training, system-specific training that would complement the professional development system. So getting back to the application itself, I think that it's really important to look at this, because obviously this is how your applications are going to be scored. So they want to know the extent to which different systems are included. In other words, the different types of early learning development programs are included and addressed. So obviously they're not looking for a one system professional development system. They're looking for a professional development system with a progression of licensure and certification that will be common across those systems. The evidence, here again, those two words are popping up, aren't they? There's a common statewide competency framework, and they're expecting you to be able to submit that, or at least I would think very clearly describe how it is that you're going to be developing that or building upon what you already have. I think that there are 47 states now that have these things, or the beginning of these things. So we're quite farther along than we used to be. And they want to make sure that it is this body of knowledge is designed to promote children's learning and development to improve outcomes. So, and then there's criteria there before. So let me just say really quickly then where we are today, and I want to note this literally is 20 years later. We have legislation. We tried every way possible to accomplish articulation and making sure that everything counts, and we weren't successful until we participated in legislation that mandates articulation, so that we have vocational modules at the undergraduate level or at the 100 to 200 course numbered levels, and not only we wrote the legislation, but it really is applicable to all other vocations as well. So nursing, business, engineering, all other vocational groups have been able to develop vocational modules and take advantage of this articulation legislation. And I think that it's important. The other thing that I would really recommend is partnering, especially partnering with unlikely partners like the police force, firefighters. There are people out there that need this just as badly as we do. Where we are today, we have common leveled competencies across systems, and as a result, that has enabled us to develop a common course of study or a universal catalog of courses at the AA level and the BA level. And then that has allowed us to do both vertical and horizontal articulation. And it has, I think, one of the things that's most exciting, because many of our institutions of higher education are one-person shows, we're able to offer courses at any institution that anyone in the state is able to take and have it be transcripted and transfer into their home college course of study, because they're all it's all the same course of study. We have a state-issued equivalent to the CDA that is embedded in our coursework and leads toward the AA degree. And we now have 3 professional preparation pathways, because very early on we realized that the classroom teachers have very different competencies, are required to have very different competencies than early interventionists and home visitors. And so we have an early childhood teacher, and we have 2 licenses now. We broke up a birth through 3rd grade license into 2 parts so that teachers are able to have more an area of specialization, essentially. One teacher license that's issued by our public education department is for birth through age 4. The other is age 3 through grade 3, then program administrator, and a family infant toddler studies certificate at the AA and BA levels for home visitors and early interventionists. I just want to reiterate that it's really important to create a common vision, create common vocabulary, and come to a common understanding of the definition for that vocabulary, make some foundational decisions that are a broad-based, common consensus, and be very intentional and get legislative authority.
Thanks, Dan. Really appreciate your comments. I want to encourage you to either unmute yourself with *7 in order to ask a question, or you're able to use the chat box, and we are monitoring the chat box, and I can ask the question for you. Dan's provided an overview of building state systems. And I actually want to do one question to get us started. Dan, you made a really strong point that this had to be in state government. And I know some of my colleagues around the country who are in state government may not find that as easy. You gave us the window of 20 years. But could you comment on why you think state government is so important, and if not state government, then who? And then, Sue, maybe you can comment on that as well.
Well, you know, if you look at the legal profession, that's not within state government. That is and there are other examples, you know, of professional organizations. However, I think in today's world, if we want to professionalize our field, and we have significant investments being made by state government, I think that we look at our counterparts in elementary and secondary education and we say, how do they become a third grade teacher? There are, well, at least in the state of New Mexico, state government develops competencies that they expect a third grade teacher to have. And then if a higher education program demonstrates that their graduates would have those competencies upon graduation, and that program is approved by the state, and after they have a degree certifying essentially that they have gained that competence, the state issues licensure to that person. We've essentially used that same model, that there are essentially state-determined, generally determined competencies that an early childhood professional would need to have in order to teach children birth through age 4 or age 3 to grade 3. And then we've embedded that set of licensure in our public education department in order to really give it legitimacy, and because right now we want those teachers of pre-K, for example, who are teaching pre-K in a child care center to be able to say, we have the same competencies, we have the same licensure as the person teaching pre-K in the public schools.
Right.
And we need to be able to be compensated equitably.
Right, and I guess the point you're making, though, is that, and it's critical for the application, is that the professional development doesn't sit outside of the larger system of early childhood, the larger early childhood system, because when you compare it to public education, that's also a place where curriculum and assessment and other things are set. Sue, did you have a comment?
Well, I do, actually. I think, Dan, I really understand Dan's point about state government being a driver, but I think it's a driver because we don't have a profession yet. I think professions create themselves. So you talk about nursing, for example, and nursing has created those levels, the profession of nursing. It's owned by the profession, and clearly it's the competencies are driven by what the larger system needs, so it's driven by that. But there is a transition. You know, in nursing, the profession has created gates. They're gatekeepers of who's in and who moves up and at what level and what competency, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we're not there yet. And so I think the role of state government is to drive us there, to help us get there. But it's got to be in partnership with the profession. It's got to be in partnership with higher ed. I mean, it's got to be in partnership with all the systems, because Head Start's being driven at the federal level. How does that integrate with what you're driving at the state level? So I think it's a very complicated, arrangement between all of the parties, with state government having a very dominant role. It has the money, it sets the standards for programs, et cetera, that makes it pivotal, puts it in a pivotal position. But I think at some point, I hope that state government will have to move over a little bit when the profession is ready to grab hold of it.
Great, and I think that's a great transition, Sue, to you talking about the workforce specifically, and I think it makes the point that while we're talking about including those larger systems in the conversation about how we will think about our workforce system, our professional development system, that we also have to include the people who are actually doing the work if one day we want to get to that transition. So the next section, I didn't see any hands or comments, and we'll hopefully have some time at the end for that as well, is really focusing on who is that workforce and how do we support that workforce to build so that we're ensuring children are ready for kindergarten. The competition does say you have to work closely with post-secondary institutions. I say that's a global responsibility, that everyone needs to be getting a college degree. It benefits young children, but it benefits, in fact, that individual. And I know, Sue, you share some of that opinion. And it also encourages the state to think about things like retention and improvement of educator quality, again, going back to career advancement and professional development and compensation, and making sure that that's having an impact on young children. So let's turn it over to Sue to focus more on D2, which is about the workforce members themselves.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to be here. This is obviously a topic near and dear to my heart. The D2 section is about how you're going to support your early childhood workforce in terms of knowledge, skills, effectiveness, and retention by doing two things. One is increasing access to professional development, and the other is creating policies and incentives to promote effectiveness in career progression along an articulated path. So, the way I look at this, it's begging the question, what carrots and sticks are you going to use to improve the workforce and create an articulated system? And whatever you do, however you do it, it has to be aligned with your knowledge and competency framework. It has to link training with professional development strategies like the use of practica, student teaching, coaching, mentoring, and it has to be evidence informed to support effectiveness in improving outcomes for children with high needs. In addition, you have to pay particular attention to capturing data on the workforce in terms of its development and retention. And there are tables within the application that you will have to complete about the workforce and about professional development institutions. And you'll be asked to complete these throughout your 4 years. So getting your baseline data on your workforce and on your professional development institutions is got to be critical in the completion of the application, and also in setting your goals. And of course, you have to make sure that all countable professional development is aligned with your workforce knowledge and competency framework. So it's a lot to integrate. Sherri?
I'm sorry, looking for my mute. So again, we have a question. We want to understand what is your biggest challenge as you think about your workforce? And again, you can use the mouse on your computer and give us an answer. You know, is the biggest challenge working with higher ed, which you see is required? Is the biggest challenge your training system? And you heard Dan talk about pre-service and in-service and multiple types of training. Is it poor compensation and high turnover, or is it lack of employer investment, which we're going to hear more about? Let's see if we can get a few more. Okay, Megan, you can close the poll. So in this poll, it's pretty weighted towards poor compensation and high turnover, and Sue's going to give us some suggestions about how to deal with those issues.
I wish I had a magic bullet on that one. So I think Dan agrees with this as well, that it all starts with a vision, and your team really needs to work together to set a vision for this work, for your professional development system, for your workforce, and for the standards and expectations you have for both your direct education and care workforce, but also for your professional development and technical assistance and other support people in the field. This vision may and probably will extend beyond the life of this grant, but I think reviewers are going to appreciate seeing this vision and a timeline to that vision, as well as how these dollars help you work towards the vision. Many of you can write about some great professional development strategies you've employed, but the addition of new strategies with these dollars should be clearly targeted to address challenges in your system. We've outlined 5 basic challenge areas that we'll talk about in the next few slides, and we'll illustrate some of the challenges in each of the areas. Although the list may not be exhaustive, you may have many more challenges in one area than I've put up on the slides. And then we're going to give you some examples of strategies being used across the country to address these barriers. So the professional development challenges for our workforce come in several bullets and buckets. I'm going to start with the economic challenge. You know, the Bureau of Labor Statistics says child care workers earn $9.28 an hour, and the preschool teachers earn $12.35 an hour. Most are parents. Many are single parents. A recent workforce study in North Carolina found that 33% of teachers working in licensed child care settings, which includes Head Start and public pre-K, had no health insurance from any source. 40% had used one or more forms of public assistance in the last 3 years, and 33% did not get a single day of paid sick leave. Head Start and pre-K teachers may do a little bit better, but every state is different. So for the most part, the workforce cannot afford the professional development they need, and they cannot afford to go into long-term debt. Without addressing the economic realities of low pay and benefits, we are educating and training a workforce that's leaving children, often very young children, at rates far too high to give children the security they need. And our professional development investments go right out the door with them. I think without real career and pay mobility, some of our workforce may struggle with the futility of an investment in professional development. But overall, at least from my frame, the good news is that this is a workforce that enjoys their work and wants to learn more if given opportunity and support. But it cannot cost them too much in either uncompensated time or money. Nationally, most of our teachers in our workforce do not, in our child care workforce in particular, do not have either 2 or 4-year degrees in early childhood education. Often no one in their family has gone to college, and sometimes their family doesn't even support their going to college, making that journey even harder. In addition, professional development at night and on weekends means that the need for additional child care for many of them. Getting our workforce back to school is critical in terms of our wanting them to have some of the core knowledge and skills they need. But college means they need to have a strong level of basic skills. And nationally, about 60% of our community college students will need to take at least one remedial course. Yet ensuring that the workforce has a strong ability to read, write, and do math is a critical foundation for their work with children. A growing proportion of our workforce want their learning opportunities to be in languages other than in English. Travel to professional development may be an issue for some in our workforce. Those without transportation, those in remote areas, those that don't have internet connections for online coursework. And then finally, the vast majority of our workforce are women, many with families who have to do the family work and professional development juggle, particularly if professional development is outside of the regular work hours. Recognizing these individual barriers is critical to advancing professional development within your state. And so these are a few examples or samples that states have used to address various individual issues. Really understanding who your workforce is critical. Many workforce studies focus on program directors and do not ask teachers to provide data on who they are and their needs and goals. And without this kind of data that really listens to teachers, we would never have known that 40% of our workforce had used one or more forms of public assistance, which is a huge wake-up call for us. One innovative strategy that is happening in a small percentage of community colleges has been the movement to give developmental courses early childhood education content. So students who take those developmental courses where they learn about early childhood education while they are learning math are much more likely to continue their education. Employer support for professional development is critical, yet programs face real challenges. In all sectors, child care, Head Start, and pre-K, the economy and budget cuts have put programs at risk and have reduced or eliminated resources for professional development, even when professional development is required. Directors may not have any more education than their teachers. They may be afraid of teachers getting ahead of them on the education pathway. They may also not know what their teachers are learning and thus are resistant to the new ideas teachers bring back from courses they're taking. Many directors are barely leading their programs. They often were promoted to this position but do not have the leadership and administration skills they need. They spend days in the classroom subbing for teachers or in the kitchen subbing for cooks and have little time to engage in a bigger vision. The environment for staff may not actually support continuous learning and development. Staff may not be supported in peer learning or in sharing their knowledge gained through professional development. And then finally, individual program directors may support professional development, but they may be part of a larger system, whether it's a corporate system or a Head Start system or a public school system that has its own larger policies that really impede the advancement of professional development. So what are the employer realities in all your sectors in your state? How could you support the leadership development of program directors if that's needed? clearly providing subsidies and incentives to programs as well as to individual program leaders may be needed, but so might technical assistance and coaching for program directors. Is director development a need or priority in your vision? Our higher ed system can present students with formidable barriers. It can be impersonal and not understanding of the needs of working and or diverse students. Policies about course sequencing and completion of remedial coursework can be rigid and out of touch with the needs of working students. Colleges and universities offering early childhood education and or child development degrees may not be available in every part of your state. And then the navigation of the system, from admissions to counselors to enrollment to financial aid, can be daunting. Faculty may not either have advanced degrees in early childhood education or any experience working with young children. The early childhood education departments may not have early childhood associate degree accreditation or NCATE accreditation. Classes may not be offered at times, places, or in modalities that meet the needs of the working student population. Add to that the huge expense of books and tuition. And finally, with the recognition that it takes a long time to earn a 2- or 4-year degree attending part-time, it's extremely frustrating to have to retake almost identical courses successfully completed at one institution because the second institution won't give the student credit for the course. The challenges that higher ed faces are exacerbated right now, in particular with their own levels of funding cuts. So, one-time investment might be a very strategic use of Early Learning Challenge Fund dollars to strengthen your early childhood education departments, getting them accredited, creating appropriate coursework, increasing course offerings, and or getting early childhood education content embedded in developmental courses. Funding release time for colleges to work on articulation or creating common course catalogs across colleges may also be strategic structural investments. In many states, the bulk of training offered to our workforce comes through our child care resource and referral system, our professional associations, or through private trainers. Some of the same barriers in this system are similar to those in higher ed. However, because training is often offered by community agencies or associations, there is usually no assessment of the literacy levels of participants or any assessment of what participants learned as a result of the training. Many states rely heavily on the system but inadequately regulated. And the trainings often are one-shot with no currency that leads to credentials or course credit. So your challenge is to begin to think about your investments and how you can strengthen your training system. States around the country are trying different strategies, but strategies for improvement have to be built on a clear understanding of your goals for that system and for your workforce. So what proportion of your state's professional development do you want training to have? Does your workforce have the literacy, numeracy, and core early childhood education knowledge on which training can be built to be effective? Can you require all your training to be aligned within your framework and within your early learning development standards? Do your trainers and training institutions have the knowledge and skills to do this? So how can you use your Early Learning Challenge Fund dollars to help get you there? Many states don't have clearly defined career and credential pathways and fundamentally fail to prioritize these in standard. There's no guarantee that completion of training, credentials, or degrees will lead to significant gains in compensation. Workforce standards are minimal in child care programs and remain that way because most families cannot bear the cost of a very high-quality program where staff have degrees and fair compensation. Yet the disparate workforce and program standards between child care, Head Start, and pre-K often contribute to high turnover in children and staff. And the rates paid to early care and education programs in these systems is also highly divergent. So children receiving subsidized child care may actually be getting the poorest level of early care and education in your state. And the coordination between the various systems of early education within the state may be fragmented. You may have lots of professional development activities across the various early care and education systems, but they may be uncoordinated, redundant, and not aligned strategically with your visions. This is your opportunity with these dollars to address some of your hardest system challenges. One of the things you can do or to think about doing is to pilot strategies in communities with children with high needs to really incentivize and support teachers who are well educated and highly affected. In high needs communities, you may be able to pilot a compensation strategy that will allow teachers, the very best teachers, to work with the most needy children. In those communities, you may be able to drive quality with good rates and good compensation regardless of what parents can afford to pay. The Early Learning Challenge Fund wants statewide vision and statewide goals, but it doesn't preclude you from trying out some strategies in smaller communities and in high need communities to both advance those communities and the knowledge and skills of those children, but also to advance your learning about how to take those strategies statewide. So what are the reviewers looking for? And I think it's really important to write about why what you propose to do is needed. You've got to make the case and how it will result in a great early childhood workforce. Use data. Use data on your current workforce. Use data on your children. Use data on programs, on your professional development system, and from research, both original and secondary research, to make your case about why you're doing what you propose to do.
Thank you, Sue. Before we go on to the next section, we had a couple questions, and Dan, you or Sue can answer this. And one is, you mentioned, Sue, the TQRIS system and using it in order to do incentives. When you think about the application, a lot of that's in Section B. So when you think about this Section D, how do you think about the TQRS system? Is giving you the quality definition for the workforce and using the I to give you a system for improvement? But how do either of you think about how this workforce section fits with the TQRS?
Well, personally, I think it's at the heart of it. I think the foundation of, and I think this is why this has its own section. I think the foundation of high-quality early childhood education is the teacher, is the workforce. And so without speaking to the workforce in TQRIS, I don't know how you can advance the system. It is the foundation.
And another question was, so how do you align a state system of workforce? And Dan, you mentioned this as well, that you got to pull in Head Start, but they do have a different set of requirements. And Sue, you mentioned that they're set at the federal level. So how do you integrate and think about Head Start and this work?
Well, I think that Head Start they're part of our quality rating and improvement system, and so I think it's really important to think of them as being integrated into the early childhood system as a whole, and they certainly have requirements for professional development and for to be a qualified teacher. And so one of the things that we did very intentionally when we were starting to develop our common framework of professional competencies was to look at the requirements of all of those systems, and we looked in some depth at what is required in order to be a Head Start teacher. What are the competencies that are required in order to be successful in that role? And I think that when you look very intentionally at some of those standards, then that can really guide you. I think that really leads us into the next. Are there other questions before we go on to the next slide?
Dan, can I just say one thing about
Sure.
I think I totally agree with you that Head Start is a part of the system, and ideally, where the state becomes a driver is, Head Start being licensed. Does Head Start have to be licensed in the state? If it does, and that you've embedded your TQRIS within licensure or within licensed programs, I think there's integration there. But it's also a huge provider of professional development, and it's a huge buyer or user of your professional development system, and most primarily of your higher ed system. So that's why the Head Start's got to be integrated.
It kind of goes back to what I was saying and it goes back to what Sue was saying, as the profession itself driving the development of the system. And I think that when you have if you just have Head Start faculty sitting in a room developing these competencies in the framework, you're going to have a very different result than if you have Head Start directors, child care providers and teachers and personnel, early interventionists. I mean, if you have those consumers in the room as well, on an equal footing, saying, we expect when a person gets a bachelor's degree from your institution and we hire them, these are the things that we expect them to be able to do. And all of a sudden, higher ed is sitting there thinking, how do we do that? Where do we do that? We need to make sure that we have people placed in Head Start programs for placements. And all of a sudden, they're in a very different role when you have everybody at the table contributing to that conversation. I just want to say, and then taking it on to the next slide, is that says, that addresses perfectly, and Sherri, I think, is really right. I wish we had I before R. I wish, because we very intentionally have used our quality rating and improvement system as improvement. And I think that you can strategically, and we did not do this until now, I think you can really look at your higher education system and your system-specific training systems as part of that I. For example, most of our adjunct faculty teaching early childhood education courses in our higher education do not have degrees in early childhood education.
Right.
They may have degrees in elementary education, and they taught kindergarten, or they've taught third grade for 20 years, but their professional preparation was in elementary education. Well, a lot has happened in the field of early childhood in the last 20 years. And so one of the things that we're doing is making sure that we are applying that that improvement to our higher education system as well as to the programs, because if we're sending teachers on Teach scholarships to take courses and the faculty aren't really adequately prepared to teach those courses, we're not getting the bang for our buck that we really want to get. So
right.
we've got to look at the whole system.
Right. So I want to move on, but there is one other big idea question, and you can answer it because we've got about 10 minutes to answer to show the last few slides. But answer the question as you go through. Okay, lots of big ideas, lots of work to do, whether you're focusing on the workforce or building the system. What is your 1-2 punch? What do you start with if you can talk about that as you go through your strategy slides? What's the priority? So, Sue? Or is Dan doing?
Gosh. Well, let me think about that. Dan, are you through with your slide?
I think that we've really covered that first slide of strategy development.
Yeah. I would say back to you also is that we decided we needed to do the I with our higher ed system because we were buying a lot of professional development. And so our strategy was to help support them through the early childhood associate degree accreditation. And our goal is by the year 2015 that they will all of our community colleges, all 58, big lofty goal, will be accredited. So in terms of strategy development, as you think about this, sustainability is a big issue, and you want to be sure that what you build will live on beyond these dollars. So investing in people, systems, policy, and infrastructure are critical because of you don't want these things that you're building to go away after the dollars leave. I think, and Dan's a big believer of this, as am I, that you need to leverage the change you need. You know, just like what I was saying, if you want all your early childhood education departments accredited, you can give them money, but it's got to be clear. We're helping you do this with the expectation that you will succeed and maintain accreditation forevermore. I think the issue of compensation, you know, the little poll we did tells the story. It's a big issue, and this is an opportunity to not shy away from it. If we put all of our money in professional development strategies and there's still a revolving door, those investments are gone. And then I think there's lots of great things happening across our country in our early care and education, and we've studied a lot of strategies. Get the data on what states are doing. Look at outputs. Look at outcomes. What's working, and base your strategies on what we know is working. In North Carolina, we had a mantra when we did our plan. And every time we talked about a strategy, we would ask the question, is this lofty but achievable? So what will you propose to advance your workforce and system? Can you actually do it? The feds, it's very clear, are going to hold you to your promises. So they're going to want to see your data all along the way, all through all 4 years. We're clearly knowing that now. So be sure about this as you develop your proposal. And then again, not everything needs to be statewide. So really think about piloting and targeting strategies in new arenas and in key areas of your state.
I think that in terms of this, I just want to say that I think there are a couple big ideas. One is that I think that you have to recognize, and it would be sort of irresponsible to create a vision and then think that you're going to accomplish that in 4 or 5 years. I think, you know, be realistic about how this elephant that you're trying to move called higher education and working across systems, and lay good, solid foundation in order to do that work. I think that a lot has happened in states, and we need to appreciate that, acknowledge that. I think it's really important to put history there so that the readers really know where you are and all the work that you've already done, the accomplishments that have already been made, and then be radical in terms of the reforms that you want to implement with these dollars that are good one-time investments in developing this system. I think the other part of it is make sure that all of these sections are tied together, that the quality rating improvement system has a tie to professional development, that a conversation of the early learning guidelines, conversation of the professional standards, the conversation about the program standards, how all of that is embedded and integrated into the section on professional development. It's really critical because it all is viewed as part and parcel of that professional development emphasis.
We had a question that said the parts about the professional development system, in the state's discussions, they decided to place a description of the system in Section A and in part for B4 and not in D. Thoughts on whether or not to address systems. You know, foundationally, you are supposed to be talking about your state's success in your current state system and talking about your past investments. So it seems as something about your professional development system should be in A. And certainly if you've got a high quality plan, that would be in B. But thoughts about not doing D?
About not doing it at all?
No, you have to do either.
Not addressing the system in
no,
D.
You have to do, I think you have to do either D1 or D2. I think you have to address it
in the context of a system.
Yes, you have to do it in Section A. You have to demonstrate that you understand the whole. And without speaking to professional development, you wouldn't demonstrate that. I mean, it's a huge part. I think. Well,
and in the context of a system, I think one of the weaknesses of some of the applications that didn't win was not being able to draw a straight line between A all the way through E. So I think you should use A because you're talking about past investments and you're talking about your big idea about where you're going in a part of A. You certainly have to talk about it in terms of high quality plans in B, but you also should be referencing enough of that system so that people understand it as you talk about it in D1 or D2.
You know, we tried it two different ways, and the application actually almost requires you to be redundant.
Yes.
And I don't think there's any problem with that because you're talking about the same thing over and over again with a different focus.
Right.
And within a sort of a different context. But it's all about radical reform of this and building a system.
Right.
And all of those things are components of that larger system.
So we've got about 5 minutes. I really want to push you on the question that came in. You know, if I'm starting, you know, if this is a scale of 1 to 10 and view you all as 10, 20 years experience, you're already doing continuous improvements. We've got somebody on the call who doesn't have a system and several that have it in state government. What do you think is foundational? Where do you start?
I would say creating a common vision.
Yeah.
And if you have a higher ed meeting, don't just meet with 4-year institutions or just 2-year institutions. Everybody's in it together.
But when you go to higher ed, Dan, does that mean you're excluding the TA providers for start, or you're including them as well?
They're all we have monthly meetings, and program managers and Head Start directors and faculty are all there together in the same room.
Yeah, the professionals need to be there too. So, I mean, when you're having those conversations, it needs to include the teachers and the directors and the TA providers and the PD providers. I think that, starting with the vision, but also really have to know where you are. You really have to take a hard look at where you are and to be self-critical, to say, you know, we can have this vision, but if you don't really have a good perspective of where you are, it's going to be hard to get to a vision.
Right. So
I think an appreciative inquiry approach where you really identify where you are and the strengths of where you are and the barriers of where you are, and then moving from there.
And I think it's really important, you know, sometimes subsidy stands out here and you've got pre-K over here and you've got, you know, Head Start over here. And so integrating professional development in that context may seem difficult. But there are these clear lines, as you call them, Sherri, between these various systems that all play out in professional development. And so I think
So I want to thank Dan and I want to thank Sue for sharing their expertise with us today. More important, I want to thank Bill and the Early Learning Collaborative for putting together really a series of great conversations where we can go deeper. You see in your resources there that we've showed you some of the higher scoring plans in round one. Know that the world has changed, and so use that as a foundation. You also have information to contact. Who is doing that? I'm not doing that. Okay. You also have information in the slides to be able to contact Sue and Dan if you've got specific questions. And Susan mentioned at the top of the time that she's available to help do some matching around specific technical assistance if a state has an area where they want to go deeper and think a conversation with an expert would be helpful. We also will include, you'll get the slides in a few hours from this webinar if you registered, and at the back it has an example from New Mexico that really goes deep in how Dan thinks about his early education and care and family support professional system. Some of the big ideas are make sure you've got a common system, that you're looking to improve child outcomes. Everybody gets us a progression with continuous improvement. Make sure, as Sue said, that you're building high-quality plans that address a barrier that you can really define. And on behalf of myself and Bill, we want to wish everyone the best of luck, but know that we still got a few more weeks and also want to be helpful with you on the ground. And so we thank you so much for participating. If there's anything else you need, feel free to email Susan Hibbert at Bill or one of the presenters if you've got a specific question. Thanks so much for participating.
Thank you. Please stand by.